independents will tend to be in the forefront of favoring structural political reform that levels the playing field and essentially says, look, political parties can compete in the political marketplace, but they shouldn't also be running the competition, which is how it works right now. And so we need a nonpartisan system, we need structural reforms, and we need the right to be an independent. You shouldn't have to join a political organization in order to have your full democratic rights in the United States of America. It's that simple.
It is my pleasure to welcome to Forward the president of Independent Voting, the co-director of the Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy at ASU, and board member of the Forward Party, Jackie Salit. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you, Andrew. Great to be with you on Thanksgiving week.
So you're the co-author of this new book, The Independent Voter, with your co-director, Tom Riley, and then also a history professor named Omar Ali. I got a lot out of this book. How did this book come about?
Tom and I had been writing chapters in various volumes on the independent voter and in discussion with Omar Ali about the story that we were trying to tell. And the three of us decided that this could be a moment where writing a book that was dedicated specifically to talking about who is the independent voter, what is this phenomena about, why are they so misunderstood in the political world, which they are. And so we decided to take a shot at it, and we reached out to a couple of publishers, and Routledge Press grabbed the project right away and asked us to finish the manuscript quickly, which we did, and now we're out in print.
Yeah, well, congratulations on that. So I think of you as sort of the godmother of independent voters. You're literally the president of independent voting in a org for independent voters. How the heck did you wind up working on 3 presidential campaigns? I think you worked on Bloomberg's campaign too. Like you were sort of the paragon of independence. Like, how the heck did that come about?
You know, it's such an interesting question, and I think there were so many cross currents. Some of them were personal, and some of them, I guess, were, more contextual. But, I grew up in a very politically aware and politically active family. We were involved in the civil rights movement. We were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. We were involved in the independence movement in Africa. I would periodically come home from school and my mother would say, oh, hi, there's now 3 Nigerian students who are living with us because they're studying government and they're going to go back and they're going to, govern their country kind of thing. This was a fairly common occurrence in my house. So wow. I grew up in that kind of environment. And then I went to work for a major television network covering actually the 2 national political conventions in Miami in 1972. And through that experience, frankly, I just started to think, hey, there's something off track right now in our political system. I couldn't even really exactly put my finger on it. I know you talk about this a lot when you talk about your own decision to go ahead and leave the Democratic Party and found the Forward Party. It was a different time then, but still, I felt that it was a good moment to experiment with some other forms of political activity. So I got involved in independent politics really in the late 1970s. There were some important fights going on inside the Democratic Party in New York at that time, where Black and Latino elected officials and leaders were trying to rise up in the electoral process and in government and so forth, and they were being blocked by the party bosses. And so we entered into some coalitions then that I was a part of, created something called the New Alliance Party at the time, and a significant number of local elected officials who were basically looking to leverage their position and punish frankly, the racism and the paternalism of the local Democratic Party by going independent. And that's kind of what got me into the game. And then all kinds of things happened from there.
Yeah, I learned a lot in your book, The Independent Voter, about the presidential candidacy of a woman, Lenora Fulani, who was apparently the first black woman to be on the ballot in all 50 states, which is a freaking feat.
Yes.
And it seems like you were there grinding away, helping to make that happen. What was that campaign about?
Her first run was in 1988, and as you say, that was the year that she got on the ballot in all 50 states and became the first woman and the first African American in U.S. history to do that, which was extraordinary in and of itself. Her campaign was really, it was so prescient, Andrew. It was really about raising the issue of the state of the democratic process and the ways in which the parties have a lockdown on the parameters of policy, on participation, on they make the rules, and those who make the rules.
I just want to interject very quickly.
Yeah.
I confess, I don't remember this campaign at all, and of course, I was very young in '88.
Yeah.
I was a teenager, but I
Yeah.
remember Jesse Jackson, and I do not remember Fulani's campaign, even though Fulani's campaign in some ways made it further because she was on the ballot as an independent.
Well, really a good point, because, of course, Jackson ran for the first time in '84, and he established that there was, a very powerful insurgency inside the Democratic Party, and then that came to naught. And so in '88, when Dr. Fulani ran, her message was 2 roads are better than 1. Let's support Jackson in the Democratic primary process, because Jackson was running for a second time at that point and had a very, very diverse and broad coalition. But Dr. Fulani's plan was, and our plan was, if Jackson were to fail to get the nomination or fail to be put on the ticket, then there'd be an independent road that those voters could get on. And so that was really the impetus of the campaign. It was 2 roads are better than 1. Let's play inside the Democratic Party and go independent on the outside. So that campaign, it ruffled, more than ruffled. It stepped on toes, shall we say? And and honestly, some of the response that I see you getting, particularly from the liberal left, in terms of oh my God, you can't go independent, or if you go independent, it means you're really a right winger and all this kind of stuff. Well, Dr. Fulani, endured a lot of that, going back to the late '80s, rather, and the early '90s.
Calling her a right winger seems ridiculous.
It was so revealing. I'll tell you, in 1988, when we were just launching the campaign, I write about this in the book. One of the first things that you have to do is register with the Federal Election Commission, of course, if you're, raising money, and you have to file the name of a committee. So she filed the name of her committee, and it was called Lenora B. Fulani's Committee for Fair Elections. And the Federal Election Commission said to her, you can't call the committee that, because what does fair elections have to do with running for president? So right away, we were in a legal battle with the FEC, which, as you well know, is made up of Democrats and Republicans only. And we had to fight that. We actually won that fight. But it was, it was such an education, I'll tell you, because you just came up against those baked-in biases at every level of the administration of the electoral process against independents, and it was a real learning experience.
And so you went from there to the Perot campaign in the next cycle, is that right?
Yeah, what happened was that Lenora ran again in 1992. And she actually started the campaign running as a Democrat in the Democratic primary in New Hampshire. And going into New Hampshire, she had raised more money than every other candidate other than Paul Tsongas at the time. So that included Bill Clinton, Doug Wilder, Jerry Brown, a couple of other candidates, wow. I think Tom Harkin and so forth. So she had real lot of popularity at the grassroots level. And after the Dem primary, she moved to be an independent and ran the rest of the campaign. Perot ran also that year for the first time. And during the course of the campaign, she recognized, I think very smartly, that Perot was getting a lot of coverage. Perot was allowed into the presidential debates. Perot was really driving the issue of running as an independent, independent voters, independent approaches, all of that. And so her message shifted at a certain point, and basically what she told the public was, look, I'm a black woman, I'm a progressive, I've been out there for a long time fighting in the trenches, now I'm running as an independent. If I'm too black, if I'm too much of a woman, if I'm too radical for you, don't vote for me. But vote for Ross Perot. Vote for an independent. Use your vote to make a statement about the importance of creating something new for the American people. So, of course, Perot got in, got out, got it, back in, all that kind of crazy stuff. At one point, he was polling at 42% of the vote. But in the end, he got 20 million votes. And during the course of that campaign, Perot activists around the country started to reach out to Dr. Fulani and ask her to come and speak at, the Perot campaign in Orange County, California, which is one of the most conservative districts in the country. Asked her to come out and speak, and she did. And she talked about the need to bring people together and re-engineer, reimagine, redesign our political process. And she got a huge response. And so after the campaign was over, I would say a network of Perot leaders at the state level reached out to us, to her and to us, and said, hey, can we sit down and talk? And so from that point on, there was a coalition between the Fulani movement and the Perot movement at the grassroots to try to generate a new national political party. And we formed something called the Patriot Party, which was really designed to push Perot and push the Perot movement as a whole to go independent and build a party, not just be an independent candidate, but invest in building a national infrastructure. And we succeeded in doing that. So by 96, we were building the National Reform Party. We had a national all-independence primary in which Perot and former Colorado Governor Dick Lamb ran, and Perot got the nomination, and we ran that campaign at that point as a party-building campaign.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Holiday season is around the corner, and even though Christmas and New Year's are festive, celebratory times for a lot of us, they're also really depressing times for a lot of us. It's easy to get anxious or lonesome or to question things. I first saw a therapist when I was a teenager and have been a big believer ever since. And BetterHelp is a fantastic way to get the help you need. As the world's largest therapy service, BetterHelp has matched 3 million people and counting with professionally licensed and vetted therapists available 100% online. Plus, it's affordable. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to match with a therapist, and if things aren't clicking, you can easily switch to a new therapist anytime. It couldn't be simpler. No waiting rooms, no traffic, no endless searching for the right therapist. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/yang. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/yang. Wow. So the 96 Perot campaign, I confess to not having as clear a recollection of. In 92 we got 19%. I remember him in the debates. What happened in 96?
In 96, he got 8.5%, which set in motion, of course, as you know, a lot of states have, a benchmark of a number of votes that you have to acquire, generally speaking, in a presidential race or in a gubernatorial race is often the case, and that establishes a ballot status party. So by the time we came out of the 96 campaign with 8.5% of the vote, we had ballot lines in 30 states. And that was huge.
Yeah.
And then, we began to embark upon the process of what it meant to actually build all of those state party organizations to keep it as a unified national party. But the platform of the party was very different than what a typical party platform is. And you know that well because you've been developing that also for Forward. But it was really focused on political reform, and fiscal reform. And then we set up a series of task forces to engage certain kind of hot button issues like the immigration question. And I was the chair of the immigration project, and everyone said, "Oh my God, this thing is going to be a bloodbath," because you have people on the right. The Perot movement was very engaged and agitated over immigration policy, and the Fulani movement as well, arguably on different sides of the fence. We all sat in a room together, and it turned out that there was so much common ground there, and we hammered out. It wasn't exactly a platform, but really kind of maybe a set of values and ways that we thought that Congress needed to proceed in order to deal with the issue. Now, of course, ultimately, when the matter, got into the hands of Congress, they couldn't do anything with it, or maybe more accurately, they wouldn't do anything with it. Because as you're very fond of pointing out now, and it's chilling, politicians do better when they don't solve problems than when they do solve problems, because then they can sort of just keep hammering on the issue and that the other side didn't come in and do what they were supposed to do and blah, 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 blah. But the fact of the matter is that if you take all of that junk and partisanship out of the process and you just put people to work on the issues, there's a lot of progress that can be made.
Wow, so 96, you're on the ballot in 30 states. You are putting together this policy platform. What happened to the Reform Party? Because now people are looking up, being like, where the heck did those 30 state chapters go?
Yeah, that is really a good question. I can tell you my narrative on it from where I sat. A couple of things happened. First of all, when Dick Lamb came in and ran in the primary in 96, he obviously had come from the Democratic Party, and he ran a campaign which he lost. He refused to endorse Perot. And this kind of set a tone, I would say, within the party where there was a lot of fractiousness and also kind of a wing of the Democratic Party which then began to try to attack the Reform Party, to challenge its credibility, to challenge the process by which it was being built. And so that kind of weakened the situation a little bit. Then in 98, Jesse Ventura ran for governor in Minnesota on the Reform Party affiliate line there. He won that election, which was extraordinary. But then Jesse, who, I think, was, did a lot of really good things and really brought forth the issue of independent politics, and also he won a governorship as an independent. But there was also a lot of friction between him and between the Perot group, kind of a power struggle that went on that never really fully got resolved. And then Perot's running mate in 1996 was Dr. Pat Choate, who was an economist who was one of the very first people to ring the bell very loudly about the negative impact of globalization on American manufacturing and jobs. And he and I became very close, I would say, and very connected. And he called me one day and he said, Pat Buchanan is a friend of mine, the conservative commentator, of course. Pat had just come out of the Iowa straw poll and he did very poorly. And he and Pat were very close, Pat Choate, and Pat called me and he said, Pat Buchanan is thinking of leaving the Republican Party and coming to seek the Reform Party nomination in 2000. Are you open to that and would you consider that? I said, well, if Pat Buchanan is coming in and will support the principles of the party and back burner his social conservative agenda and stand up with us for political reform and fiscal reform, then that's something that we would consider. We had lunch with Pat Buchanan at the Essex House. It was all very hush-hush, the meeting. We did it at the Essex House on Central Park South in New York, and Pat and his sister flew on separate planes from Washington because they didn't want to run into any reporters and anybody see them and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, we had the meeting, we had the conversation. We said this to Buchanan. He said, I'm down, I can do it. I'll go with you on the reform front. I'll back burner everything else, et cetera, et cetera. And we said, okay, well, private conversation, let us, kind of digest this and whatnot. And then he went on CNN that night and he told the story of the the meeting. So I was like, well, okay, that's so much for the, the secret off the record meeting. But we put together a coalition, and I will tell you, in the early days of it, Andrew, it was incredibly exciting because here was a very prominent right-winger and a well-known and popular progressive, a left-winger, who was also African-American and a woman. And we put together a coalition and said, hey, we're going to put our ideological differences on the back burner, and we're going to focus on these structural reforms and reconstituting American democracy in a more fair and inclusionary manner. And that went well for about 3 months. And then Pat Buchanan basically abrogated the deal. And though I'm not privy to the information of exactly what happened, I can tell you that I believe that the Republican Party and Republican leadership leaned on him like nobody's business. I mean, the media went crazy in response to the coalition on the left and on the right. And we were, the incoming was from all sides. It was kind of like you didn't know where to look and there was nowhere to hide kind of thing. But it was good because it really brought these issues out to the fore. And I can tell you that Lenora got so many letters from people who were part of Pat Buchanan's base saying, I'm so glad that we're working together. I'm so glad that we're building these bridges, and all of that. But basically, Pat abrogated the deal. He started to run what was essentially a takeover operation inside of the Reform Party. Because of the strength of the showing in 1996, we had qualified for $18 million in general election matching funds. He grabbed the money. He grabbed the nomination. There was a split convention. He grabbed the nomination. The courts upheld his claim, which was somewhat specious, frankly. He took the money and he ran a very, very poor campaign. And for all intents and purposes, that was the end of the Reform Party.
One thing I'm thankful for, I wrote a book. It's called Forward, and it's now out on paperback. I promise you, it is not as boring as a book with democracy in the title sounds like. It's got fun stories from the presidential. It'll make you think. It'll make you laugh. And you can check it out on paperback or get it for a friend. Happy holidays. Forward, now out on paperback. So you talked about the $18 million in matching funds the Reform Party got because Perot had done well in the prior election. The threshold is 5%. If your party's candidate gets over 5% in a national election, then your party receives matching funds in the next cycle, which now I think would be closer to $30 million. And there is a minor party that I shall leave nameless that asked me to run on their ticket because they thought I'd get them over 5%, and they were just in it for the money. They just wanted the $30 million next time. It's something that a lot of people aren't aware of, but the Reform Party was one of the very few parties that actually beat that threshold and got matching funds in real life.
Exactly. And there is what they call a primary matching funds program where a candidate has to raise a certain amount of money spread out over, I think it's 20 states with contributions from different congressional districts. It's a pretty onerous requirement. Dr. Fulani got federal primary matching funds in 1988, and I think she got close to $1 million in primary matching funds, which meant she had to have raised $1 million, and then she spent the entire match on ballot access and on the cost of getting on the ballot.
Oh, that's actually helpful because I was wondering how she pulled that trick.
Yeah.
There was a point when I was running for president that someone showed me the requirements, And I actually did pass them, by the way.
Yes.
Like we were looking at the matching funds. Now, no major candidate uses the matching funds because it restricts how much money you can spend. So it also marks you as uncompetitive.
Yes.
But when I looked at it, it was actually a pretty good value. I could have gotten millions of dollars in free money. It just would have capped my overall spend at, I
Your
think, the
overall
number.
spending. No, exactly. That's the trade-off. And so the major party candidates don't use it anymore. And there's also Congress has looked at the question of abolishing it altogether. And in the Klobuchar-Manchin compromise version of the democracy bill that the Democrats put together, they would have abolished the federal primary matching funds program. Now, their legislation did not move forward, but it was on the table and it was in the bill. So, this stuff is all on the chopping block now. And,
yeah, it seems a little bit anachronistic, but I did look at it and I thought, ooh, maybe I should take advantage of this. Because even if you run within a Democratic primary, you could qualify for the money.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so I looked at it. I mean, happily, thank you, Yang Yang. We got to a point where it would have not been a net win for us in terms of
Sure.
our competitiveness. But if we had been below where we were, my campaign raised $40 million, and that was high enough so that we could spend more in the early states than the cap. But if we'd been at something like the $10 million range, then the matching funds probably would have been a net win for us. I think we would have gotten another, maybe like $8 to $10 million in matching money. So there's by the way, there's like an equation, you can draw it out, but there's a threshold,
exactly. A calculus.
below which the matching funds are a win. Any enterprising future presidential candidates out there, you can check it out and take advantage of the system while it's still there.
Hurry.
Jackie
It's
says
going to go
hurry.
away.
So you are in many ways like the guide to all of independent political movements over the last 40 or 50 years. So you went from there to Bloomberg, is that right?
We did, and that was really cool. We had established a ballot line in New York. So even after the Reform Party imploded, we still had the state party. And so beginning in 2000, we cross-endorsed. And New York, by the way, also is what we call a fusion state. I know you're familiar with that practice. Only 8 states allow for fusion. And
it's too bad. Fusion voting is great.
It's excellent. And there's a terrible Supreme Court decision on the fusion question, which came down in the late 90s.
Fusion voting is something that's in effect in 8 states. It's very positive. And what it means is that if you are a minor party, you get your own line the next time, which is massively advantageous because then you can actually endorse candidates and your endorsement is meaningful. By the way, Connecticut is a fusion voting state, and that's how the Forward Party affiliate in Connecticut managed to get the governor to endorse ranked choice voting, because in order to get that line, which the consultants estimated was worth 3%, they said, hey, got to endorse ranked choice voting. Now, unfortunately, the other states have realized that this is good for minor parties and been going around getting rid of it. Is that all a fair description?
It is. I mean, the basic principle of fusion is that a candidate can run on more than one party line, and those votes are aggregated, and the voter can choose which line they want to cast a vote for the candidate on. And what that does is it gives, as you're saying, it gives leverage to minor parties and allows them to enter into and to play within and interact within the political mainstream in ways that are much more powerful than just being a third party that gets 2% of the vote and gets to make a point about an issue but doesn't really have an impact. But in any event, Mike was going to run for mayor. We had cross-endorsed some Republicans for local office, and so the Republican Party was kind of like, oh, hey, what's this? Maybe we can use this to get support from independents. And Mike had, as you know, Mike had been a Democrat, but he knew he could not get through a Democratic primary. So he re-registered as a Republican and pretty much got a pledge from the Republican Party that he would have the Republican line. However, Mike both wanted a way to engage with independent voters, and also he was an independent, and he also needed a line where Democrats could vote for him without pulling a Republican lever. And so he reached out to us, and we had a series of meetings with him about the campaign, and he made a very simple pledge to us, which was that if he were elected mayor, if we endorsed him and gave him the line, and if he were elected mayor, he would lead the charge to bring nonpartisan open primaries to New York City. And we said, deal, absolutely. And he said, actually, he said, smart businessman that he is, he said, now, are you sure you want to make this deal? Because if we pass nonpartisan elections, it's basically going to put you out of business. And we said, yes, actually, the whole point of this party is to put ourselves out of business. We want a nonpartisan process, not one that's based on parties. And yes, we would love for that to be the case. So we made the deal. He ran. Of course, 9/11 happened on primary day. So, the whole political environment was very upended. But the outcome was that he won the election by 35,000 votes, which was an incredibly narrow margin. And he got 60,000 votes on the Independence Party ticket. So basically, we were his margin of victory, and the independents were his margin of victory. And that set up what became a 12-year partnership with Mike, because we endorsed him in 2 successive elections. And he kept that promise. He empaneled a charter revision commission. He actually empaneled 2 commissions, because the first one didn't put it on the ballot, and the second one did. It went to the ballot, and we lost 70-30. But the key thing, Andrew, to know is that every political party, other than the Independence Party, every clubhouse, every newspaper and editorial board except for the Daily News, every union, and all but 1 or 2 elected officials opposed the initiative. The New York Times editorial board editorialized against it viciously, as did the New York Post. So, frankly, the fact that we got 30% of the vote, which as I recall was something like, 140,000 votes or something. It was also an off-year election. It was just the whole thing was very challenging, but the entire political establishment came down on us and just tried to crush this thing. And, we were able to put, I think, maybe 600 or 700 volunteers out at the polls with, vote yes on, I think it was question 3.
Wow. Yes on question 3. That seems familiar. Go ahead. Continue.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. But the unions put thousands of people out at the polls with vote no messaging. And, and we just weren't strong enough to withstand it. And the funny thing is that all the newspapers after the election tried to blame Mike and said, Mike is really weak and he's, because they were still very against him. Even though he was an excellent mayor, he just wasn't part of the club. And they were like, this shows Mike is weak and blah, blah, blah. And so then I called all the reporters and I said, it wasn't Mike's fault. It was our fault. It was the Independence Party's fault. We just simply weren't strong enough to carry the day.
There are a lot of battle wounds from trying to open up the system. So you did all of this work as an independent political activist. Now you're the co-director of this new Center for an Independent Sustainable Democracy at ASU. And in many ways, you're trying to make the independent voter or political independence a real thing in terms of academic study, journalism, et cetera. So here are the obvious questions that people could ask. Who the heck are independent voters? What are they? How many are they? Are they real, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, those are the key questions. Well, according to the Gallup polling, the Gallup polling organization and Pew Research, 40 to 50% of Americans, the number fluctuates, month to month, but between 40 and 50% of Americans identify themselves as independents. And that is huge. Now, those numbers have been growing and its reach has been growing. So, it's now the case that I think it's 51 or 52% of millennials and Gen Z identify as independents. 40% of Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans identify as independents. Depending on the state of where you are, like in Arizona, for example, 41% of Latinos identify as independents. And something like 33% of African Americans below the age of 30 identify as independent. So it just kind of cuts across generational lines, racial lines, geographic lines, and so forth. Now, for 50 years or more, political science within the academy has had a methodology for examining the independent voter and for voter identification overall. And their methodology is, their first question when they survey is they ask people how they identify, Democrat, Republican, or Independent. If you say Democrat or Republican, they take it at face value. But if you say you're an independent, there's a follow-up question asked only to people who identify as independents. And the follow-up question is something like, well, which party do you identify with? Or which party are you planning to vote for in this cycle? Or which party did you vote for in the last cycle? Or towards which philosophy do you lean, Democrat or Republican? So then people, for the most part, answer that question. And then political science uses that information to determine that you're not really an independent, that you're really what they call a leaner or a shadow partisan. And consequently, rather than accepting the numbers that are based on actual polling in which people say who they are and how they identify themselves, they redefine you based on the answer to the second question. And they come up with a statistic that says, well, there's really only between 7 and 10% of Americans are, quote unquote, what they call true independents. And, and on the one hand, you could say, well, that's just academia, that's the ivory tower. But the fact of the matter is that, and I'm not an academic, but I do see the influence that academia has and that political science has. It just spills out into the polling community, the politician community, the media community. And so through this methodological sleight of hand, which essentially denies the thing that the person just said to you, 30 seconds before, this community of Americans has been written off or essentially channeled into being partisans. But the fact of the matter is, Andrew, that, and I think you know this from your personal experience and also just from traveling around the country and talking to people, if you identify as an independent, that has meaning. You are saying something by doing that. Now, what are you saying? Well, I've done a lot of surveying and polling of that issue, of focus groups, but just talking to people, because as the president of independent voting, that's what we do. Independents are making a statement of, I would call it a statement of non-compliance with the dominant culture. They've said they're an independent for a reason, because they don't want to have to shoehorn themselves into a partisan or an ideological category. They'll often tell you they want to vote for the person, not the party. And that is meaningful to people. And moreover, we have found, and I think this is important given what's coming around the bend now in the country, is that independents will tend to be in the forefront of favoring structural political reform that levels the playing field and essentially says, look, political parties can compete in the political marketplace, but they shouldn't also be running the competition, which is how it works right now. And so we need a nonpartisan system, we need structural reforms, and we need the right to be an independent. You shouldn't have to join a political organization in order to have your full democratic rights in the United States of America. It's that simple. So at the Center for an Independent and Sustainable Democracy at ASU, we're trying to come at that issue. We're trying to poke holes in the methodology that's been used. We're trying to elevate the interaction and the analysis of independent voters. And we're finding that the volatility among independents, the refusal to be categorized, people move in and out of independent status. They vote for Democrats one cycle, they vote for Republicans in other cycles. Independents supported Barack Obama in very significant numbers in 2008. Then they swung for Trump by 4 points in 2016, and then they went for Biden by 13 points in 2020. So, this is a community of voters which is very, very hard to categorize, and we should stop trying to use the old categories to understand them and create a new framework for engaging with them.
Yeah, you said a couple of things in the book where I was like, wow, you put it that way. It's pretty hard to argue. So number one, apparently the United States is the only democracy where election officials belong to one party or another, which makes a lot of sense that other places are too smart for that, because it wouldn't make sense to have someone wearing a party jersey controlling elections as the district writer or the secretary of state or whatever the heck it is. So that's number one. Number two was you should not be using taxpayer money to fund party primaries if you're not allowed to vote in them because independents pay taxes. So it's like, wait a minute, why are you spending money on some primary that I don't get to participate in?
Well, look, those are two really important points. And, as you say, we talk about them, we write about them a lot in the book. It's really that we have these practices is really an example of the ways in which the parties have managed to conflate themselves with the government. But they're not the government, they're political parties. And they should be, they're protected by the First Amendment, and that's proper, and they can be political associations of like-minded or semi-like-minded people, and they can engage in a whole host of activities. But secretaries of state should not be partisans. The highest election officials, in any given jurisdiction should not be partisans, and taxpayers should not be funding the activities of private organizations that invoke their right as private organizations to exclude people from participating in the electoral process. So that's all the stuff that needs to be fixed. It's really not that complicated. It makes a lot of sense. And I think part of what's happening in the country, going back to some of the history we've been talking about, when Perot was raising these issues, when Fulani was raising these issues, the question of democracy and the structure and design of it was considered an outlier issue. That's not the case anymore. The question of how we run our elections and who gets to decide and how the votes are counted and all of that, the peaceful transition of power, that's all center stage in our country right now. And, frankly, we should have taken care of these issues 25 years ago, but we didn't, and now we do.
Oh, yeah. Now we can sense that we're in danger of losing our legitimacy to our own people, of slipping into authoritarianism or autocracy or some version of it, because in a two-party system, if you have one bad leader, then everyone in that party falls behind that leader because it's better them than the enemy, which is the other side. Polarization is so extreme. So they should have been taken care of 30 years ago, and the problems, frankly, weren't quite as nasty as they are now. One of the things you write in the book, which I found fascinating, it's like, so what's keeping this in place is like a whole set of pressures that are enforced by the media, that are enforced by various actors, where they really try and shunt away any discussion of the two-party system. And I was like, wow. You're such a fascinating figure to me because you've been engaged in the struggle for years and years and years and years. And then along comes, I'm going to call myself something of like the new kid on the block, like Andrew Yagg's, like, hey, like two-party system messed up, which, by the way, I didn't really get into the guts of until 2020 when I wrote Forward, and I was like, oh, now I get it. Like, we're living through this terrible design flaw that is just going to get worse. So given everything that you've seen and been through with the Reform Party in particular, when Forward came along, first, you've been awesome and generous and like an incredible asset and champion from the beginning. But like, how the heck are we going to succeed where this other movement that was at least at one point funded by a billionaire, or another point had like these bookending conservative and black women progressive leaders, like how are we going to succeed where they failed? I do think the climate is much better for us now than it was then in some ways. Like the trust in like the media to call it straight is like much lower now than it might have been then. There are so many different ways to get information. The number of people who identify as independents might be twice as high now as it was then.
I think that, well, first of all, I thank you so much for your kind words here. I think there's a certain leadership quality that you bring to the table, and others in the Forward Party do. But so for example, you and I, we went to Chicago a couple months ago, and we met with a group of black ministers and community leaders there, all of whom have, or most of whom have been very attached to the Democratic Party, in Chicago, as is the case for the bulk of the black community. And we sat in one of the minister's studies at his church on the West Side, and we spent 3 hours talking, and I saw you be able to respond to their questions and their concerns and the realities of, what they're dealing with their congregations and with the poverty on the West Side. And, the Democratic Party politicians blow in and out of their churches. And I saw you talk to them about how you saw these issues and the extent to which that if their association with Forward meant that the Democratic Party showed up and said, hey, yeah, okay, we've been ignoring you, but now we're going to pay more attention and we're going to bring some more stuff into your community. But you have to stay with the Democrats in order to do that. You said, well, if that happens, then I consider Forward a success because you used us for leverage
Yeah, it's true.
to get something good for the communities that you represent. And if that doesn't happen, and if we're able to grow and become an independent force and you're associated with that, then all good too. And so I've seen you do that, and I've seen you, and that's a very particular kind of conversation to have. You have you're very honest with people. You don't try to sell them a bill of goods, but you actually do talk to them about the political leverage that can be acquired by being independent. And, you and I were just I live in Arizona now, but you came to Phoenix, and we, met with some political people there, and some of them said to you, well, what's the relationship between all of these reforms that are necessary and building the Reform Party? Because they might seem like they're opposites. And you said, well, we're building this party in order to use it as a leverage tool in order to accomplish these structural political reforms, because that's what we think needs to happen now, and that's the most important thing to do.
So one thing I want to run by you, I think I mentioned it to you when we were in Arizona together, but one big idea that I have for 2024 is we get a bunch of independents together in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the 6 swing states that are almost certainly going to decide the 2024 race. And the margins are very narrow, less than 1% in 3 or 4 of these states. And what we do is we get a list of, let's call it, several 100,000 independent voters and say, hey, we're genuine swing voters. We can vote either way, and we're going to back whichever candidate or party supports various reform measures, and then we enumerate them and say, like, if you do these things, we'll come your way. What do you think? My bright idea for the title so far is 5% in 6 swing states, or 5 in 6 for short. What do you think?
I love it, and I actually think it's a really good way to go. For one thing, it uses the fusion strategy without having to only be in a state that allows fusion, and I think that's very creative. And going back a number of years, we used a similar strategy that we called the CHIP process, choosing an independent president. And we did the very thing that you're describing, kind of at I would say on a smaller scale. And also the country was less divided in the way that it is today. But look, leveraging the power of the independent voter is crucial right now. This is what is going to develop and mature the electorate, and that needs to happen. So I love that idea, and I will tell you, I have networks of independent voters in all of those states. And
you're the president of independent voting. That's what I'm talking about. Independentvoting.org, right?
That's
I get
right.
that URL right?
Yep.
Yeah, so in the book, you talk about the three things that independents can do. Number one, they're the change makers, because when they push in a direction, then the parties have to respond. Number two, they can get behind these reforms to move us to non-ideological, post-partisan reality, which is what Forward is fighting for. And then the third thing we can do is we can actually swing races in various ways. And thinking about independence in those ways really felt quite empowering. Where you thought, and this 5 and 6 plan, in a way, it demonstrates just how absurd our current system is, that a couple 100,000 voters who just happen to be in Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, could essentially control everything. 44 of the states are irrelevant. It's just these 6, and it's just like the sliver of people. But I loved your expression of what independent voters both have done and hopefully can do in the future.
Yeah, and we saw a lot of that in the midterm elections. I mean, independents were 31% of the electorate nationally. I think that's the biggest national number that we've seen, maybe ever, but certainly in 20 or 30 years. In Arizona, they were 40% of the electorate, and independents, delivered the Senate race for Kelly, delivered the governorship to Katie Hobbs, delivered the Secretary of State election to Adrian Fontes. So a huge, powerful force in Arizona. But let me just say, the Democratic Party should not assume that means that independents are now Democrats. That's something that the parties tend to do at the end of every cycle. They are not. They made a choice in a particular historical context, as you were saying. That's what you've got to focus on. It was also true in Nevada. It was true in the Senate race in Georgia thus far. I think Warnock had an 11 or 12 point margin among independent voters over Walker. And independents broke for the Republican for governor. So there's just, there's a lot of volatility, a lot of differentials based on what's happening in a given state and what's happening in the country overall. I think it would be very fair to say, and the evidence shows this, that independents saved our democracy in this election. But it's really just a holding action. That's all it is. And that's why I think, what you're doing with the Forward Party, and I'm happy to be a part of it, what all of the leaders of the Forward Party and all of, the Forward Leadership Council and the folks who are signing onto the website and all of that, that is a force that can, I believe, make a huge leadership difference for the country in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, my wife said something which I thought hit pretty close to home. It was like, living on the edge is not a strategy. So someone else said,
yes,
like dodging a bullet is not necessarily a strategy. When I was in Arizona with you, I said, hey, thank you for helping us dodge a Kerry Lake-sized bullet. How many of you are confident we can keep dodging that bullet here in Arizona for the next 2, 4, 6, 8 years? And not a single hand went up. I mean, what was the margin?
Right.
Like 20,000 votes? I mean, everyone knows. It was like, we could buy the barest of margins. And some of the folks that we met with, you and I in Arizona, are now excited about a ballot initiative that's very much like Nevada's, that would shift to nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting, which I see. Now, that's a sustainable strategy. It's like you look up and you say, okay, Kerry Lake almost became governor of this thing, despite being, like an election denier and a demagogue in my mind, pretty clearly. So, if you change the process, then you have a way out of this. I think Arizona is going to be one of the ground zeros for democracy over the next 2 years. And by the way, it's going to be one of these 6 swing states I'm talking about. Though forward, obviously, there's a lot to do before then. But I think there's a lot we can do in Arizona. So after everything you've seen and done, are you more optimistic about our ability to achieve these reforms, relative to what has gone before? Where do you think we are? Give us a bit of historical perspective to close us out, and then let people know where they can keep up with you and your work.
Sure. Look, I think it's going to be a tug-of-war process. I don't think it's going to be a linear, straight road. I mean, look, there's already talk in Alaska that the legislature might take it upon itself to repeal the open primary ranked choice voting piece that was passed there. In Nevada, as you say, state law requires for a citizens initiative to be enacted, it's got to pass twice. And the parties kind of laid low in Nevada on this last go-around. They are going to come out full force in 2024. As you say, there's going to be an effort here in my state, in Arizona, to go to ballot. There's going to be a lot of resistance, unless, frankly, I think one of the things that's interesting to me about Arizona is that because the Democratic Party was such the beneficiary of the independent voter, they really need to wise up and stop acting like the independent voter doesn't really exist. They need to make moves and accept overtures to create a significant coalition here that recognizes and respects the sovereignty of the independent voter and creates a partnership around a political reform agenda. But I think that we could be talking about a situation where we're going to take some losses, in 24, because there's going to be blowback and it's going to be powerful, and it could succeed. But I don't worry about that, honestly, in one way, because I think we'll put up a fight, and the more the public comes to understand what's at stake, the more the public is engaged and involved, and the more there are places like the Forward Party or independent voting. And people can go to our website, independentvoting.org, to get more information. We do wonderful programs, including spokesperson training programs to help independents be able to tell their story about why they decided to become an independent, or connect with us at ASU. I think our movement is going to grow. Whether we face setbacks in terms of, the enactment of some of these reforms, I think we have to be prepared for it, but we will continue to go forward. And I think the overall environment and the overall historical circumstances favor our cause.
Fantastic. Well, more and more Americans are waking up to the fact that this is not sustainable, this is not working, and you are someone I've learned a lot from, and have been fighting for really the American people for a long, long time. So thank you so much, Jackie. Independents unite. Let that be the message for all the ticked off Americans out there who want something better in our leadership.
I love it. I love the message. And yep. Yes.
Independents are real. That could be the subtitle.
Exactly.
For this book,
real.
The Independent Voter. Congratulations on this as well.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Andrew. Great talking to you.